Good afternoon. So today is Thursday, January 17th, and I am going to be finishing up the little bit of the course introduction stuff or the stuff from the first day that we should have gone over, and also talk to you about our topic for today, which is the structures of American politics, including things like political culture, ideologies, and economics. So where we're starting today is a conversation about demographics. So why is that important? Well, if you remember from our conversations on Tuesday, one of the reasons that we start with sort of basic ideas about what is going on in American government is that it helps give us a better context for what will come later as we learn about the Constitution, about civil rights and liberties, and about the structures of the institutions of our government. So I want you to understand not only the formal institutions of government, like Congress and the presidency and the courts, but also the non-governmental and in some senses informal rules of the American game. The things that have a big impact on our lives and our politics, but don't necessarily show when we talk about the official parts of government. Another way to think about this, and this will be even more explicit later on in today's lecture, is that this is kind of, well, one of the ways we can think about this is as American political culture, or the ideas, the ocean of ideas and values in which our politics swim. So let's talk a bit about the demographics of the United States, because those kinds of issues, who we are, where we live, the kinds of things that are important to us make a big difference in terms of our politics and in terms of how politics impacts our daily life. So, this is the stuff we did on Tuesday, so I'm going to move on here. All right, so one of the important pieces of information about the United States is that we are growing. So interestingly, we are growing at a larger rate, at a higher rate than most other developed democracies. So we had 10% growth between 2000 and 2010, which are when we have censuses, right, every 10 years. We're at 326 million citizens in 2017, and we're the third most popular country after China and India. We have a higher overall birth rate, which is unique among wealthy and developed countries, but it actually varies significantly by ethnicity in our country. Overall, immigrants tend to have more children than native-born Americans do, but by second and third generation, families tend to have fewer children, more sort of toward the national average. And we're above replacement level. So the average number of children is like 2.5 or 2.4 children per family unit. Obviously, that's not 2.5 children. That's on average. But that's significantly higher than many other wealthy developed countries. There are lots of places like Japan that are currently dealing with a situation where there are fewer and fewer people having children at all. And those that do have children usually choose to only have one child. So that's one piece of the American demographic makeup. The second piece is that we are becoming more diverse. And so over time, our population mix has really changed. We've always been a nation of immigrants. But who those immigrants are and where they're primarily coming from really have depended on the time period. So early to mid 1800s, we're talking about primarily people from Central Europe, mostly German, and actually some of the earliest immigration to the United States, those people who come either during the Revolutionary War or right after the Revolutionary War are frequently of German descent or are ethnically German. In fact, that's what Cincinnati, that's who primarily settled Cincinnati, right? And Cincinnati's first charter is somewhere around 1788. And so many German-speaking people settled in Cincinnati. in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And this is the time of places like Ellis Island that we know of, and that sort of large influx um, of, of immigrants comes primarily from Eastern Europe. I have ancestors who came through Ellis Island on their way here from what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And then we really shut down immigration pretty significantly around the time of World War I. And the immigration laws didn't really change again until we get to the 1960s. And then once we move into the 1960s, we're talking much more about immigration to the United States from places like South Asia, from the Middle East. And this is when we start getting a significant amount of Muslim immigration into the United States. Muslim immigration into the United States. So notice that I have a lot of information or a lot of places on here where people are coming from to the United States. But we know that significantly there is an enormous amount of ethnic and background diversity among Americans. Even those who are primarily of sort of European descent or who are primarily of Asian descent. So obviously the current controversies, and we're not going to discuss immigration as a policy issue right now. We're going to probably do that later in the semester. But when we talk about diversity and we talk about sort of the ways in which America is changing demographically, we know that both legal immigration and visa status is controversial as well as illegal immigration, though illegal immigration is in decline over time. And it does have patterns of increase and decrease depending on what's going on in other parts of the world. Obviously, our primary areas of illegal immigration are across the southern border. But in reality, what we know is that there are many more people who are in this country illegally who have overstayed their visas from some other place in the world. And that's actually a bigger number than those people who cross the border to come into the United States illegally every year. So when we look at immigration totals in the United States, what you can see is that it's the interesting thing is that we've sort of switched here, right? So the blue line is total number of immigrants, and the red line is the immigration rate. So that's the proportion of people living in the United States who are first-generation immigrants. And we've had other time periods where we have had much higher levels of immigration rates than we do today, even though we now have a larger total number of immigrants than we ever have in the past. And that just has to do with the fact that the United States is also growing in general. So we're a much bigger country population-wise than we were before. We can also look around the country and looking at the ways that we are becoming more diverse, and we can see sort of what the breakdown is of race and ethnicity in the United States. And again, this is 2000 and 2010 numbers because we do a census in this country every 10 years. So we are gearing up to do another census in 2020. And what you see when you see numbers of population that are in between those years of the actual sort of every single person gets counted sort of census is something that the Census Bureau runs called the community surveys, where they sort of figure out using sampling how many more people have come into the country every year or how their identities have changed and things like that. So what we see over time here looking at race and ethnicity in the United States is that overall we're becoming less white. There's a larger proportion of Hispanics in the country in 2010 than there were in 2000. African American and Native American and Alaskan natives have sort of stayed the same. But we are seeing increases in other groups and in Asians and in general a larger amount of diversity in our population over time, and that's growing over time. We're also moving, right? So we're growing, We're becoming more diverse, and we're moving. And we're moving west and south and to the suburbs. So what we can see over time is that there's a lot of what we call Sun Belt migration. Now we're going to see a map in a minute that sort of shows you where the population center of the United States is. But what this means really when we talk about we're moving south and west is that people move for better weather. That certainly seems to be part of the issue, particularly because we see the biggest move or the biggest shift toward the Sun Belt after the 1960s, which is when truly useful and widespread home-based air conditioning became available. And so it became possible to live year-round in places where it had been harder to live in the past. We also know that that sort of Sun Belt migration has coincided with an increase not only in like service jobs, what we would expect if there was just a population move, but also for things like to the degree that the United States still has some industrial jobs. Many of them have moved toward the south as well. So what you can see here in this map is it's the center of the American population. And basically what it's telling you is that over time, we are moving more south and more west. And that's why when we start talking about the reapportionment of congressional seats later on in the semester, what we're going to see is a drop in the number of seats that places like the Midwest and the Plains states have, and an increase in the number of seats that places like California and the Southwest have, particularly over the last 100 years. We're also growing older. So today in the United States, 13% of the population is over the age of 65. By 2050, it's projected that this number will be 20%. So we can see that the population is aging. The proportion of our population that's aging is getting larger. But if you look at the actual median age, it's a pretty big contrast. So the median age in 1800 was 16 years. So think about that. The median, remember, is the center person. So if we lined everybody up who lives in the United States by age. In 1800, the person who's standing in the middle would be 16, which means half the population was 16 or younger. In 2017, that median person is 38. So that means that half the population in 2017 is 38 or older. Now, the reality is that we're still, because of the birth rate and everything we talked about earlier on in terms of our growth, is that our median age is actually growing more slowly. So we are aging more slowly than other developed countries, and that's still primarily due to immigration. So why does this matter, or why do all of these things matter? Well, because the characteristics of who people are, where they live, and where they came from have a real implication for what their politics are going to be. So in this particular sense, when we're talking about the population growing older, we know that it means that people who are over 65 have larger amounts of voting power. Also, because as we're going to see later on, people who are 65 and older are the most likely to turn out to vote. People from the ages of 18 to 25 are the least likely to turn out to vote. And so if a larger proportion of the population is made up of those people who are likely to vote, then their interests are going to get more widely represented in our government than people who are younger and who vote less. It's also one of the reasons why Social Security and Medicare are such a big deal, and why they are two of the really large government programs that everyone is afraid to touch when they start talking about maybe cutting the budget or changing the way that the country spends its money. And that's a significant, that has significant implications for how we make policy. So the other piece of this, particularly as I'm showing change, right? So we talk about growth, right? I talk about increase in diversity, and we can show that over time, and changes in the pattern of where people live and their ages. These types of changes to the makeup of the country's population put stress on the way we understand who we are as Americans. These changes tend to alter how we see democracy as a whole, and it tends to alter what we think are important policies to follow up on and which ones we want to see go away. So, in what ways do we reinforce these ideas of democracy for future generations and for new immigrants to the U.S.? Because the picture of democracy that we are showing sort of newly arrived people to the United States looks really different than it would have 200 years ago or 100 years ago, when we had an even larger proportion of the population who were non-native born. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the second set of slides, which is concerns political culture. So this is the information, this is the stuff we would have covered today had we had class. So this is kind of an extension of the conversation that we've been having about demographics. So political culture is the common perceptions of the rights and obligations of citizenship and the rules for participating in the political process. It's agreement on fundamental principles, but not specific policy issues. So what does this actually mean? Well, these are a set of expectations about the rules of the game and about how we govern ourselves. So some of this is about politics, yes, but a lot of it is also about the things that we expect from our government, the way we expect government and our representatives to respond in times of crisis or in terms of other kinds of not necessarily policy issues, but sort of baseline commitments. So there are some pieces of the political culture that you can sort of come up with off the top of your head. So these are things like democracy, right? So that's a fundamental commitment in terms of our common perceptions of the rights and obligations of citizenship. The Constitution, the American flag, the English language, to some degree things like individualism and sort of personal liberty. Those are all things that we have as common expectations about the way the system will work and the things that it will value. So that's really what we're talking about when we talk about political culture. The other piece of this, and the components, I would say, of political culture also include a set of ideas, which we've sort of alluded to before, right, when we talk about the difference between majority rule and minority rights. And for this, one of the basic pieces of our American political culture is this notion of procedural guarantees. And these are things like the rule of law and a level playing field, right? We expect the laws to apply to everyone. We expect to have some version of political equality. We expect to have the right to vote and govern ourselves. And we expect people to have, or individuals to have, a similar amount of political power when they go to the polls to vote. Now, there are a lot of ways and a lot of exceptions to this way of thinking, but at the end of the day, almost everyone you will talk to in the United States would agree that this is a principle or an expectation that we have of government. Another piece of this is individualism. Now, generally speaking, I don't like to necessarily talk about American exceptionalism or the ways in which America is unique. Because honestly, our system, the way we think about democracy, the kinds of challenges that we deal with, lots of other democracies in particular have those kinds of challenges. But this is one where we really are different, and it does make an enormous impact on how we see politics and what we think politics is for. So we expect individual people to have a lot of rights, and we expect individuals to use those rights. We expect people to be autonomous when they vote, and we expect people to have pretty significant amounts of individual freedom. So now there's sort of two sides to this, and we talk about this a lot. On one hand, we expect there to be a lot of equality of opportunity, right? So if individuals are going to be able to be free, we all need to have equal access to the opportunities that we need in order to be free. Things like education and those kinds of things. But the issue here, though, is that there's a significant debate in our country about the differences in outcome and the degree to which we should and can balance equality with individualism. And actually, this is something we're going to talk about pretty much throughout the entire semester. This conflict is going to come up. We all agree at some level that we should have an equal playing field, right? That there should be an equality of opportunity to have access to individual rights and freedoms. But there's a lot of controversy over the actual outcomes, right? Is something illegitimate because the outcome creates inequality or creates people's, or let me say that differently, or hampers people's ability to exercise their own individual liberty. This is a real core conflict, but it comes from this deep expectation of our individualism. And so I find this to be a really, really interesting figure. What it's laying out here is the percentage of people who talk about things that are more important. And the blue line is that freedom to pursue life's goals without state interference. And the yellow line is state guarantees nobody is in need. And the purples are don't know. But what you should notice from this figure is that the United States is basically flipped from all of these other European democracies, right? 58% of us say that freedom to pursue life's goals without the state's interference is more important than the state guaranteeing nobody is in need. And that is actually directly flipped from Great Britain. And as you go down the list of countries, you see that the yellow line, the state guaranteeing nobody in need, gets higher and higher, or has a higher proportion. So this is something that makes us very different. And it does sort of seep out into all the different avenues of politics, of policymaking, and of how we view the relationship between citizens and government. The other ways to think about this, or the other kinds of sort of dominant culture or values beyond this idea of individualism, are the things that we would point to probably from the Declaration of Independence, right? Liberty and equality, right? People have the freedom to pursue life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, which interestingly is actually from John Locke, and he said property. And it is absolutely the case that the capitalist system has an enormous impact on how we view democracy and how we view the policies that our democracy produces. And so we can pretty confidently say that when we're talking about dominant culture or values, when we're thinking about, remember we talked about political culture as the ocean of ideas in which our democracy swims. Well, liberty, equality, property, or the property rights and the rule of law are an important piece of this. So I want us to talk here for a minute about what we mean when we talk about liberty. Some of this will become more obvious as we go along, but it's worth pointing out here that there's sort of two ways of thinking about liberty. And we'll deal with this sort of more explicitly and more practically when we talk about civil liberties and civil rights. But on the one hand, we have what we call negative liberty. Negative liberty is freedom from something. Now, the best way to think about this is that civil liberties operate as negative freedoms. Why is that? Well, civil liberties are the liberties that are guaranteed to us by the Bill of Rights in the Constitution. And the goal of the Bill of Rights is to lay out the limits to government interference in individuals' lives, right? So that's the whole idea of the First Amendment, right? Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech. or of the press. Congress will make no law a step to creating an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Those are all about instructions that says government can't touch this. And that's really negative freedom, right? That we are free because the institutions of government are limited in their ability to deal with these things. Now, we can talk about and think about other examples, but those will come up as we talk through civil liberties in 2 weeks, I think is when we get there. Now, we can think about positive liberty on the other side of that. And when we think about positive liberty, we're talking about freedom to do something, right? So this is not about having the space to do something, right? So you're not being given a free area to do something because the government can't interfere. What positive freedom is about having the ability to take advantage of that freedom. So we think about positive freedom when we talk about civil rights, right? Now, we can link these two things together, but civil rights tends to be sort of slightly broader than civil liberties, in the sense that civil rights are about having the freedom to partake of our rights and duties as citizens equally, right? Another way to think about this is that we think about negative freedom as sort of freedom from interference in the government telling your parents where you can go to school, for example. The Supreme Court has ruled over and over again that parents get to decide where their children go to school. If we're going to think about that same idea of education, we talk about it in terms of positive freedom. What we're saying then is that parents need to have the freedom to send their children anywhere they want to, right? So it's not that the government can prevent them, but they also need to have the ability to choose good schools for their kids. That would be a positive freedom, right? So that's how we can think about this contrast between positive and negative freedom. And I think that it will make more sense to you once we talk through civil liberties and civil rights in a few weeks. All right, so in this context, when we're talking about political culture, the ideas in which our democracies swim, the other piece of this, or one of the other pieces of this that we need to talk about, is political ideologies, right? Because we can all share fundamental commitments to individualism and to equality, and yet not agree at all on how to get there or to get to those goals and values. And that's where political ideologies come in, because they are political ideologies are the sort of the baseline set of understandings of the world that people hold, or at least their understandings of the political world. So, and the way we talk about them in the United States primarily is that we're talking about sort of the difference between liberalism and conservatism. Now, other countries have a broader spectrum of political ideologies, and there are some other sort of smaller versions of political ideologies that we can talk about that are around in the United States political arena. But generally speaking, we're talking about liberalism and conservatism. So let's define liberalism. Liberalism is a political ideology that believes that people are rational and that the human condition can be improved using rationality. So because liberalism in general understands the world to be able to be improved by human effort, there's sort of two ways of thinking about this, and this will be true for conservatism as well. So we can talk about classical liberalism. And classical liberalism is the kind of liberalism that the founders were talking about and that you hear about when you read John Locke or when you read Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And these are things that you will read if you take one of the political philosophy classes from the poli-sci department. But classical liberalism is basically a fundamental commitment to natural rights and to a specific kind of freedom. So you have to think about this in context, right? If classical liberalism is a function of the Enlightenment, it means that it's, 200-300 years old. So think about what freedom would have meant in that context. So this is both social freedom, which in this case meant equality before the law. Why is that? Well, think about it, right? In the monarchical systems of old Europe, what's happening? Well, people have different rights depending on what class they belong to. If they're commoners, if they're aristocrats. And what the notion of classical liberalism brought in was this idea that everybody should be equal before the law, that it shouldn't matter whether you're a peasant or whether you are a duke. That the law should work the same for both of you. And so that's why social freedom is part of this idea. And then also economic freedom. And classical liberals did, generally speaking, fit into this idea of Adam Smith and capitalism. But that's because back in that time, even in sort of market-based systems, of which there were plenty, in many cases the political system interfered a lot with economics and the particularly the colonial system, right, which we'll talk about next week when we talk about the American founding, where countries like Britain just used a lot of the resources from their overseas colonies to fund public works project or other things like that at home. And so classical liberalism basically was saying that people ought to have natural rights that everybody gets because they're human, and that they should have social and economic freedom based upon that. And that should all sound really familiar, because those are the basic arguments of many of not only the founders, but the philosophers on which the founding generation based their experiment in democracy, so in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Now, so when we talk about modern liberalism today, however, that's not really what we're talking about. Honestly, for both what we would call modern liberals and conservatives, this idea of classical liberalism, we're all pretty much on board with that, because that's sort of the founding principles of the United States. But modern welfare liberalism looks different than classical liberalism, as modern conservatism looks different from that as well. So modern liberalism has a much sort of broader understanding of the role of government. And that is because modern liberalism comes out of a recognition of how large governments have grown over time, right? So welfare liberalism doesn't really come into play in the United States or in other countries until the early to mid part of the 20th century, particularly in our case, the New Deal through World War II is what really sort of cemented this idea of a modern sort of more welfare liberalism. And so one of the big pieces of this is the role of government. So from the perspective of the welfare liberal, the role of government is to regulate economic competition in order to cure the social ills and redress individual injuries wrought by capitalist competition. So that's the idea here. It's a support for capitalism, right? And we'll talk more specifically about capitalism in a few minutes. But it is a recognition that there are some social problems that come out of a commitment to capitalism. And so that the role of government in that context is to help fix some of those things. Modern welfare liberalism is strongly committed to positive freedom. People aren't free until they are free to succeed and free from want and illness. Right, so that's what you were seeing when we saw that individualism figure, right? That in many European countries, this notion of welfare liberalism is much stronger there than it is in the United States. And then in modern liberalism, one of the ideas is that government is the solution, because society on its own can't coordinate well enough to satisfy the true needs of the people. Only government, from this perspective, is strong enough to ensure the protection of historically discriminated against people like the working class, women, and minorities from sort of the ravages of big business. So that's kind of what we're talking about when we talk about modern welfare liberalism. Now, remember, when we're talking about ideologies, we're generally talking about a spectrum, right? So it's fairly rare to find a group or a person or a politician who embraces all of these ideas at once. But the same is going to be true for conservatism as well. So let's move on and talk about conservatism. So conservatism is a political ideology that's characterized by a distrust of human reason, resistance to change, and a reverence for tradition. So again, we're going to have two versions of this, a classical version and a modern version. In classical conservatism, what we're talking about is it's really a set of oppositional ideas to classical liberalism. First of all, in classical conservatism, the argument is that people are irrational, so that they're not able to control their passions and desires well enough to be able to use their reason to create better societies. And so because of that, classical conservatism wants to hold on to existing tradition and structures. Now, why is that? Well, think about it as sort of the root word of conservatism, which is conservation, right? Or to conserve something, to hold on to something. Because the argument basically is if something has grown up over time and lots of different people and generations have used the system, then it's probably a pretty good idea. Because humans are irrational, and if they try to fix something, they're probably going to break it as they make new things. That's the basic underlying commitment of classical conservatism. So people are irrational, and they're not able to control their own passions and desires well enough to fix their society. It has a strong commitment to individualism across the board, basically for that same reason, right? That individual people are going to be better able to decide their own individual interest than is a group, but they're much more concerned about a good society, right? Because they want to be able to hand down these institutions that have worked for many generations. They want to be able to hand those down to future people. And so it's important to continue to create a society that functions. And that is almost more important than individual liberty for most classical conservatives. Now, modern conservatism takes some of those ideas and sort of mixes it together with some of the classical liberal ideas. So in modern conservatism, you are looking at a very strong commitment to capitalism. Why? Well, because capitalism allows people to be more individualistic. So, right, it's this combination of things from the classical versions of the ideologies. But free markets are really important to modern conservatism, as is constitutionalism. Basically, they want a focus on the law, a government of law and not of men. So while classical liberals, right, are looking for individual freedom, like equality before the law, the reason that's important for modern conservatives is because that law is the thing that we're passing down, right? It's the institution, the structure that is working, regardless of who is living under it. And so there's a strong focus on constitutionalism. And then modern conservatism has added a focus on social issues, basically things like traditional values. So home, family, religion, right? This is what is going on about sort of creating a good society to hand down, and then also an individualism, which they are going to interpret as non-intrusive government, right? So you can see where there are developments that happen in these ideologies over time. But that's why we talk about both liberalism and conservatism as there's a modern version and there's a classical version. Now, here's the thing, is that while those are sort of the two main branches of political ideology in our system, there's other stuff going on. And one of the most important other things that's going on is what we call populism. And there can be populism within conservative circles, and there can be populism within liberal circles. So this is something that can sort of fit into either side of the ideological spectrum. But populism is focused on a hostility to power and the powerful. And so it makes sense that we would talk about this in our current political context, because so much of our politics on both the right and the left, so for both Republicans and for Democrats, is about opposition to elites, to about people who have held power for a long time. And it's very welcoming of newcomers, of people with sort of short histories in politics, or people who can say legitimately, hey, I've not been in politics for a long time. I bet I have new ideas. So the populist agenda has sort of varied throughout time. The targets change depending on who's in power, right? So sometimes populism comes from the left when the right has been in power for a long time, and vice versa. What usually happens, though, or what the most practical kind of thing that happens when we see populism becoming important, is we see political candidates sort of posing as ordinary people, or trying to identify more closely with average or ordinary people. This is how, for example, somebody like Donald Trump can become president, who, while asking people to think of him as someone who's just like them, someone who doesn't have any experience in politics, even though he was much, much wealthier than an average person and had a very different life experience than the average person. But that's what happens in populism, is that it basically, candidates sort of can grab onto popular discontent by saying, hey, I'm not like those other people. And that's basically what populism is, and what it does. At the end of the day, what we end up having conflict about in our system, and much of the conflict that we can point to in terms of politics and policy in American government today, really does come down to this notion of freedom versus equality. And the reality is that we've never really solved this. And frequently, these two issues are going to be in tension, because they're both foundational values that we hold in the United States, that individuals can be free, but that individuals are also equal. And it's pretty obvious to see when we look at it that the more equality people have, the less freedom they have, and vice versa. The more freedom they have, the less equal they are free to be. And that is a reason why populism has been growing over time, or has different periods of popularity in the United States. It's also why there are deep and abiding conflicts, not only about how much money we ought to spend on something, for example, but whether we should be spending money on it at all. The healthcare controversy in the United States, in many ways, really does come down to a freedom versus equality kind of argument. And lots of times we come to some sort of solution that's somewhere in the middle, right, that balances the individual freedom versus people's equality with one another. But sometimes it's just really hard to get there. So I'm actually going to stop here. I'm going to go ahead and finish up our conversation about the economy on Tuesday when I see you, and we will also move on to talk about the American founding at that point.